Elena Marlowe screamed and dropped to the marble floor the instant Adrian Voss's fingers touched her shoulder. Both arms slammed over her skull like a woman bracing for a bullet, while 50 of Chicago's most powerful men went dead silent, watching a housekeeper unravel in front of them. The Mafia boss froze, hand still hovering in the air, staring at a woman who had served his family in silence for 8 years now, curled on his ballroom floor, like a survivor of something unspeakable. In that single frozen second, Adrian Voss realized the quiet woman who scrubbed his floors was hiding a secret powerful enough to destroy his entire empire. Before we continue, if stories like this keep you up at night, wondering what you would do in her place, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The chandelier lights in the Voss mansion burned gold that night, the kind of gold that only comes from old money and older secrets. 50 guests moved through the ballroom in tailored suits and silk dresses, senators shaking hands with men whose fortunes came from places no one dared to ask about, judges laughing at jokes told by men they had quietly protected for years. It was Adrian Voss's world, a world where power wore a smile and violence wore a suit. And Elena Marlowe moved through it the way she always did. Silent, invisible, a ghost in a black uniform, carrying a silver tray of champagne. She had worked in this house for 8 years, long enough to know which floorboard in the east hallway creaked, long enough to know that Adrian took his coffee black and his silence louder than his words, long enough that most of the staff had stopped noticing her at all. That was exactly how she wanted it. "Elena," said Marta, the head housekeeper, her voice sharp over the noise of the party. "Table 4 needs more glasses. Move." "Yes, ma'am." Elena kept her eyes down as she crossed the room, weaving between guests who never looked at her twice. She had trained herself for this. Eyes down, shoulders soft, steps quiet. Never linger near a conversation. Never make a man in a nice suit feel like you were listening. She had survived 14 years by being nobody, and nobody had ever tried harder to disappear inside her own name. But some nights, no matter how careful a person is, the past finds a way to reach through the crowd. It started with a voice. "And the Bennett girl, God, that was a mess, we cleaned up nice." A heavy-set man in a navy suit was saying to another guest near the bar, laughing the way men laugh when they think no one important is nearby. Whole family gone, and not one reporter ever asked the right question. Elena's hand did not shake. Her feet did not stop moving. But something inside her chest folded in on itself, a small collapse only she could feel. Because that name, Bennett, was not supposed to exist in this room. It was not supposed to exist anywhere. She had buried Sophia Bennett 14 years ago in a shallow grave of forged documents and a new social security number. And she had promised herself, sworn to herself, that name would never surface again. She kept walking. She delivered the tray. She refilled glasses with hands that betrayed nothing. Inside her mind was screaming. Who was that man? Why was he talking about the Bennetts here tonight in this house? Was it a coincidence? Elena did not believe in coincidences. Coincidences were for people who had never had to run. She found a quiet corner near the kitchen doors and pressed her back against the wall, breathing slowly, counting the way her therapist years ago, before she'd cut off every thread that could be traced, had taught her to count. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The room kept spinning with laughter and clinking glass, and none of it touched her, because she had built a wall around herself brick by brick for over a decade. And that wall had never cracked, until Adrian Voss walked past her at the wrong moment at the wrong angle, and reached out simply to steady a tray that was tilting dangerously in her trembling hands. "Careful," he said, his voice low, almost gentle, for a man with his reputation, and his fingers grazed her shoulder. Elena's body reacted before her mind could stop it. She dropped the tray. Glass shattered against marble, champagne spraying across polished shoes and silk hems, and she threw both arms over her head and folded down toward the floor, curling into herself, a full-body flinch so violent that 3 guests actually stepped back in alarm. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, locked somewhere in a memory none of them could see. The ballroom went silent. 50 of the most powerful, most dangerous, most emotionally armored people in Chicago stood frozen, staring at a housekeeper, crouched on the floor like a woman waiting for a blow that was about to fall. Adrian Voss did not move for a full 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt to everyone watching like an hour. Then he crouched down slowly, palms open the way you'd approach a wounded animal. "Elena," he said quietly. "Elena, look at me. No one is going to hurt you." Her eyes finally focused. Focused on his face, and something in them cracked open raw and terrified before she yanked the shutters closed again and scrambled to her feet. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Voss. I'll clean this up. I'll—" "Leave it," he said. "Sir, I said, leave it." His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it now, something sharpening. "Marcus will handle the glass. Go to the kitchen. Now." She didn't argue. She fled. The party resumed within minutes, the way parties always do, among people who have learned not to ask questions, but Adrian Voss did not resume with it. He stood in the middle of his own ballroom, champagne glass still in hand, watching the swinging kitchen door, where a housekeeper had just disappeared, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Adrian felt something he almost didn't recognize. Curiosity. Sharp, immediate, impossible to ignore. Marcus Hale appeared at his elbow within moments. Tall, gray at the temples, a man who had spent 15 years in military intelligence before spending the last 10 protecting Adrian's life. His eyes followed Adrian's gaze to the kitchen door. "That was not a normal reaction," Marcus said quietly. "No," Adrian agreed. "It wasn't. You want me to talk to her?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, watching the door swing gently on its hinges. "No," he said finally. "I want you to find out who Elena Marlowe really is." Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You think she's not who she says she is?" "I think," Adrian said, setting his glass down on a passing tray, "that a woman doesn't react like that unless someone has hurt her badly enough to leave a scar on her nervous system. And I want to know who. Could be nothing personal to us. Could be an old boyfriend, a bad childhood." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Could be. Find out anyway." In the kitchen, Elena stood with both hands braced against the steel counter, staring down at her own trembling fingers, willing them to stop shaking. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs. She could still hear that man's voice from the ballroom, oily and careless, repeating in her skull like a scratched record. The Bennett girl. God, that was a mess we cleaned up nice. 14 years and someone in this house in Adrian Voss's own ballroom knew that name. Elena. She jumped, spinning around so fast she nearly knocked over a stack of clean dishes. It was only Rosa, one of the younger kitchen staff, a plate of hors d'oeuvres balanced on one arm, concern written plainly across her face. Hey, it's just me," Rosa said, setting the plate down and reaching out, then stopping herself when Elena flinched back. Sorry, I won't touch you. Are you okay? Everyone's talking about what happened out there." "I'm fine," Elena said too quickly, her voice too tight. I lost my balance. That's all." Rosa's eyes narrowed slightly, not unkindly, just with the sharpness of someone who had known Elena for 3 years and had never once seen her lose her balance. "Elena, you've carried 6 trays at once through a room full of drunk senators without spilling a drop. You didn't lose your balance." Elena said nothing. She turned back to the counter, gripping it harder. "You don't have to tell me," Rosa said softly after a moment. "But if you ever need to talk to someone, I'm here." "Okay." Elena managed a small nod, though her mind was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere 14 years in the past, in a house that had burned down around a family that had once been hers. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small room above the garage, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of that man's voice over and over. She had heard many names in that ballroom over the years. Businessmen, judges, A senator once briefly before he'd lost an election under circumstances no one discussed. But she had never, not once in 8 years, heard the name Bennett spoken inside these walls. Which meant one of two things. Either it was an extraordinary, horrifying coincidence, or someone in Adrian Voss's world knew exactly who she used to be. And if that was true, then 8 years of careful, quiet invisibility had just come apart at the seams, and there was nowhere left to run. By morning, Marcus Hale already had 3 names pulled from the guest list cross-referencing the man in the navy suit who had been standing near the bar. It took him less than 2 hours to identify him as Harold Grady, a real estate developer with deep ties to city zoning boards and, more interestingly, a decades-old friendship with a man named Charles Whitfield. A name that made Marcus's stomach turn cold when he found it because Charles Whitfield had once been under federal investigation for a bribery scandal connected to a murder case that had gone conveniently unsolved. A murder case from 14 years ago. Marcus sat back in his chair staring at his monitor, feeling the pieces sliding toward each other in a way he did not like at all. He pulled up Elena Marlowe's personnel file, next the one she'd submitted 8 years ago when she'd first applied for the housekeeping position. Social security number checked out. References checked out. Previous employment, a small hotel in Ohio, checked out. Except when Marcus dug one layer deeper, when he pulled the actual employment records from that hotel in Ohio, instead of trusting the summary on her application, the dates didn't align. The hotel had no record of an Elena Marlowe working there during the years she'd claimed. He tried her college transcripts next. A small community college, an associate's degree in hospitality management. Except the registrar's office had no record of that name either. It was as if Elena Marlowe had been assembled piece by piece out of paperwork that looked real but crumbled the moment anyone actually pushed on it. Marcus rubbed his eyes and reached for his phone. "Adrian," he said when the call connected. "We need to talk, in person." They met in Adrian's private study an hour later. The heavy oak door closed, the morning light cutting hard lines across the room. Adrian sat behind his desk, arms crossed, watching Marcus pace with a folder in his hand. "Talk," Adrian said. "Her entire employment and education history is fabricated," Marcus said bluntly. "Not sloppy fabrication either. Professional. Someone built this identity for her, or she built it herself. But either way, whoever did it knew exactly how to make paperwork survive a background check. The kind of background check most employers run, not the kind I run." Adrian's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Go on. There's more." Marcus set the folder down on the desk and flipped it open. "Guest list from last night. Harold Grady. Real estate developer, sits on 2 zoning boards, and he's been close friends for over 20 years with a man named Charles Whitfield." "I know that name," Adrian said slowly. "You should. Whitfield was investigated 14 years ago for bribery tied to a murder case in Ohio. A family named Bennett. Husband, wife, and their teenage daughter went into some kind of witness protection situation after the husband apparently witnessed something he shouldn't have. Case went cold. Whitfield was never charged. And guess what name Grady was saying at the bar last night right before your housekeeper had a breakdown on your ballroom floor?" The room went very quiet. "Bennett," Adrian said. "Bennett?" Marcus confirmed. Adrian stood slowly, walking to the window, staring out at the manicured grounds of the estate his father had built, the empire he had inherited, and expanded, an empire built on the careful management of secrets. He had spent his entire adult life learning that nothing happened by accident in his world. Nothing. "You think Elena Marlowe is the Bennett daughter?" he said, not quite a question. "I think it's the only explanation that fits every piece we have," Marcus said. "The fabricated identity. The reaction last night. The timing of Grady mentioning that name in this house of all houses. I think whoever the Bennetts crossed 14 years ago, some of them are still walking around in your social circle, Adrian. Which means the girl who's been mopping your floors for 8 years might be the only surviving witness to whatever your father's old friends did to that family." Adrian's jaw worked, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. "My father knew Whitfield." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "My father knew a lot of men like Whitfield. I know that too. Adrian turned back from the window, and for the first time since Marcus had known him, he looked less like the cold, calculated boss the city feared, and more like a man staring down the barrel of a truth he did not want to see. Find out everything, he said. Everything about the Bennett case. Everything about Whitfield's connection to my father. And find out carefully, quietly, whether Elena Marlowe survived something that has anything to do with my family. And if she did, Adrian's eyes were hard. Then I need to know before whoever sent Grady into my house last night decides she's a loose end worth tying off. 3 floors below, Elena moved through her morning duties with the mechanical precision of a woman running on pure adrenaline and no sleep. She changed linens. She dusted picture frames of a family that had built its fortune on blood she didn't yet understand. She avoided eye contact with everyone, especially Adrian, who she'd glimpsed once that morning across the courtyard, watching her with an expression she couldn't read and didn't want to try. By early afternoon, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, an old prepaid phone she kept for exactly one purpose. Only one person had this number. The message was 3 words long. They found you. Elena's blood turned to ice. She ducked into the small laundry room off the west hallway, locking the door behind her with shaking hands, and typed back with trembling thumbs. Who found me? How do you know? The reply came almost instantly. Grady saw you 8 months ago, recognized you from an old photo. He's been talking. Get out tonight. Elena stared at the screen until the words blurred. 8 months. Someone had recognized her 8 months ago, and she'd had no idea had gone on living. Cleaning, existing in this house, believing she was safe, while somewhere out there, a man who'd once helped bury her family's murder was quietly circling closer. She typed one more message, her fingers barely steady enough to hit the right letters. I can't just disappear. Not without knowing why. Not this time. There was a long pause before the reply came. You know why. Same reason as 14 years ago. Because you saw something you weren't supposed to see, and the people who did it are still powerful enough to make sure you never talk. Get out. Tonight. Elena sank down onto an overturned laundry basket, pressing the heels of her palms into her eyes. 14 years of running. 14 years of new names, new cities, new lies, told so many times they'd started to feel almost like truth. And now, right when she'd finally built something that resembled a life, even a small, invisible, quiet one, it was all collapsing again. But something in her had changed since she was 17 years old, hiding under a bed, while men in her family's living room discussed how easily bodies could disappear. She was tired. Tired of running. Tired of being erased. And there was something else now. Something she hadn't expected. Adrian Voss had looked at her last night after she'd collapsed on his floor in front of 50 of the city's most powerful people, and he hadn't looked at her with suspicion or disgust, or the cold calculation she'd expected from a man in his position. He'd looked at her like he wanted to protect her. She didn't trust that look. She had learned a long time ago not to trust powerful men who looked gentle. Gentleness was often just patience, waiting to turn into a weapon. But some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had kept Sophia Bennett alive inside Elena Marlowe for 14 years, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this time was different. She was still sitting there, phone clutched in her hand, when a knock sounded at the laundry room door, sharp and unmistakable. Elena. Adrian's voice low and steady on the other side of the door. Open the door. We need to talk. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She shoved the phone deep into her apron pocket and stood smoothing down her uniform with hands that still trembled slightly. Mr. Voss, I'm working, Elena? His voice hardened just slightly, not with anger, but with the unmistakable weight of a man used to being obeyed, and something else beneath it, something almost like urgency. I know about the Bennetts. I know Harold Grady recognized you 8 months ago. And I know that whoever is protecting the people who destroyed your family is probably standing in my ballroom drinking my champagne on a regular basis. So you can open this door and talk to me, or you can keep running, and I promise you running from what's coming will not work this time. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Elena's hand hovered over the lock. Everything in her told her to refuse to slip out the small side window behind the dryers, the way she'd once slipped out of 3 other lives before this one, to disappear into a city that had swallowed better people than her without a trace. But for the first time in 14 years, she was tired of disappearing. She unlocked the door. Adrian stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made her unable to. Behind him, Marcus Hale stood a few feet back, arms crossed, watching with the careful stillness of a man ready to react to anything. "How long have you known?" Elena asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since last night," Adrian said. "I didn't know the details until an hour ago. I know your name isn't really Elena Marlowe. I know your real name might be Sophia Bennett. I know your family was involved in something 14 years ago connected to a man named Charles Whitfield, a man my father used to call a friend." Elena's breath caught. "Your father? I don't know yet how deep it goes," Adrian said, his voice low, careful, but underneath it, something that sounded almost like dread. "But I intend to find out. And I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Because if the people who erased your family are the same people connected to mine, then we are both standing on the edge of something that could destroy us both." Elena stared at him for a long moment, 14 years of silence pressing against the back of her throat like a wall about to break. "You don't want to know the truth," she finally said, her voice trembling but steady. "Trust me. Once I tell you, there's no going back to the life you had yesterday." Adrian's eyes didn't waver. "I stopped wanting the comfortable version of my life the moment I watched you hit that floor like someone had shot you. Tell me the truth, Elena, whatever it is. I can handle it." She almost laughed, a broken, humorless sound. "That's what everyone says, right before they realize they can't." But she stepped back from the doorway, silently inviting him in, because somewhere deep inside her past, 14 years of walls and locks and buried names, something had shifted the moment this dangerous, powerful man had looked at her, not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a person worth protecting. "Close the door," she whispered. "What I'm about to tell you can't leave this room. Not yet. Because if the wrong person hears it before we're ready, we're both going to end up like my family did." Adrian stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing like a gunshot in the small, quiet room. "I'm listening," he said. And Elena Marlowe, who had spent 14 years being nobody, finally opened her mouth to become somebody again, somebody dangerous, somebody the most powerful people in Chicago had hoped was dead and buried forever. "My name is Sophia Bennett." She began, her voice shaking, but growing steadier with every word, as if simply saying it aloud after 14 years of silence was breaking something loose inside her chest. "And I watched 3 men murder my father in our garage when I was 17 years old. One of those men called your father by his first name right before he pulled the trigger." Adrian went completely still. "His name," Elena continued. Her eyes locked on Adrian's face, watching for the flicker of recognition, the flash of guilt, anything that would tell her whether she'd just handed her life to a savior or a executioner, was Antonio Voss. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elena had heard in 14 years. Adrian's face had gone pale, his jaw tight, his hands curling slowly into fists at his sides. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice cracked on the word, betraying the doubt already tearing through him. "My father died believing in loyalty above everything. He would never—" "I was 17, Elena said, cutting him off, her voice hardening with the weight of 14 years of grief finally given permission to speak. "I was hiding behind the water heater because my father told me to run and hide the moment he heard the cars pull into the driveway. I watched through a gap in the wall. I saw 3 men. I heard every word. And I have never once in 14 years been wrong about a single detail, because that night is the only thing I've thought about every single day since it happened." Adrian's breathing had gone shallow. "Why?" he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "Would my father want your father dead?" Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Because my father was an accountant, she said. And 3 weeks before he died, he found something in the books he wasn't supposed to find. Something that connected your family's construction company to a series of payments that weren't construction payments at all. What kind of payments? Elena took a breath that shook all the way down. Payments to cover up the deaths of 4 city inspectors who refused to sign off on buildings that should never have passed inspection. Buildings that later collapsed, killing 11 people in a fire that everyone was told was an accident. The room seemed to shrink around them. My father, Elena whispered, kept copies. He was going to go to the FBI, and 3 days before his meeting they came to our house. Adrian sank slowly into the chair by the laundry room door, his powerful frame suddenly looking small. Hollowed out, a man watching the foundation of everything he believed about his own family crumble in real time. If this is true, he said quietly, almost to himself, then my father wasn't just a man who made hard choices to protect his business. He was a man who ordered the murder of an entire family to bury a scandal that killed 11 innocent people. 12, Elena said softly. They killed my mother 2 days after my father, made it look like a car accident. I was the only one who survived because a family friend, a man who worked for the U.S. Marshals, got me out before they came back to finish the job. Adrian's eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time since she'd met him 8 years ago, Elena saw something in his face that wasn't calculation, wasn't cold control, wasn't the careful mask of a mafia boss protecting his empire. It was grief. Real, raw, devastating grief. I am so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know what to say to you. I don't know how to apologize for something like this. You don't have to apologize, Elena said, though her voice trembled with 14 years of unspoken rage finally finding air. You didn't do it. But the men who did are still out there, Adrian, and some of them are still close enough to your family that they were comfortable saying my real name out loud in your own ballroom last night. Adrian stood abruptly, his grief hardening quickly into something sharper, something dangerous. Then we find them, he said. All of them. And I promise you, Elena, whatever it costs me, whatever it costs my family's name, they will answer for what they did to your family. And if it leads back to people who are still loyal to you, Elena asked quietly, if it leads to men who have protected you your entire life, Adrian's expression didn't waver. Then they were never loyal to me, he said. They were loyal to a version of my father I apparently never really knew, and I refuse to protect a lie just because it's convenient. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the crack that would tell her this was all performance. All calculation, a dangerous man simply managing a threat he couldn't yet eliminate. She found none. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I never told anyone, not even the marshal who saved me. Something I've kept hidden for 14 years because I was too afraid of what would happen if the wrong person ever found out I had it. Adrian's eyes sharpened. What is it? Elena reached beneath the collar of her uniform and pulled out a thin silver chain at the end of which hung a small, ordinary-looking flash drive worn smooth from 14 years against her skin. My father made a copy, she whispered, before they came for him. He gave it to me the night before he died, told me to keep it safe, told me it was the only thing that could ever prove what they did. I've carried it every single day since I was 17 years old, too afraid to use it, too afraid it would get me killed the moment I tried. Adrian stared at the small drive swinging gently on its chain, and Elena watched something ignite behind his eyes, something that looked almost like hope colliding violently with 14 years of buried horror. That drive, he said slowly, could burn down everyone responsible. It could burn down your family's entire empire, Elena corrected quietly. Which is exactly why I never used it. Because I didn't know who I could trust it with. I still don't know if I can trust you with it. Adrian met her eyes steadily, the weight of the truth settling over both of them like a shroud. Then let me earn that trust, he said, starting tonight. Because if Grady already knows who you are, and if he's already talked to the wrong people, we don't have 14 years this time, Elena. We might not even have 14 days. As if summoned by his words, Elena's prepaid phone buzzed violently in her apron pocket. She pulled it out with shaking hands, and the color drained completely from her face as she read the message on the screen. She turned the phone toward Adrian without a word, her hand trembling so badly the screen blurred. 3 words, the same sender as before. They know you're here. And beneath it, a second message that had just arrived, one that made Adrian's blood run cold as he read it over her shoulder. And they're already inside the house. Adrian moved before Elena could even process the words on the screen. He grabbed her wrist, not roughly, but with a grip that left no room for hesitation, and pulled her away from the laundry room door. "Marcus," he said, his voice dropping into something cold and commanding. A version of Adrian Voss that Elena had never heard directed at anyone but enemies. "Lock down the house, now." Marcus already had his phone to his ear, barking orders to the security team stationed at the gate and the perimeter cameras. "How many entry points are unmonitored right now?" he demanded into the phone. "I don't care what Frank said, check them all." Elena's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Who sent that message?" Adrian asked her, his eyes scanning the hallway behind her, alert calculating. "I don't know," Elena admitted, her voice shaking. "The same person who warned me 8 months had passed since Grady recognized me. I never got a name, just a number that changes every few months. A marshal? Maybe, or someone who used to be one. I never asked. You don't ask questions when someone is the only reason you're still breathing." Adrian's jaw tightened. He pulled her further down the hallway away from the windows, his body angled slightly in front of hers, in a way that Elena's mind registered even through her panic. He was shielding her, instinctively, without thinking about it. "Sir?" Marcus reappeared at the end of the hallway, his face grim. "Camera 4 just went dark. West service entrance." "That's the entrance by the wine cellar," Adrian said, and something flickered across his face, a memory clicking into place. "That's the entrance Grady used last night when he left the party early." "You think he came back?" Elena said. "I think someone did," Adrian said. "Marcus, get 2 men on that entrance immediately. Nobody moves through this house without you knowing about it." Marcus was already moving, speaking rapid orders into his radio, and for the first time, Elena saw the machinery of Adrian Voss's world in motion. Not the glittering ballroom version, but the version underneath it, quick, brutal, disciplined. "Come with me," Adrian said, pulling Elena toward the back staircase. "We're not staying in an open hallway." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere with 1 door and no windows." They moved fast. Adrian's hand still wrapped around her wrist. Elena's mind racing through 14 years of survival instinct, screaming at her to run, to bolt, to disappear the way she always had. But there was nowhere to disappear to anymore. Whoever was in this house already knew exactly who she was. They reached a small security office on the 2nd floor, windowless, reinforced, a bank of monitors glowing against the far wall. Adrian shoved the door shut behind them and threw the bolt. "Sit," he said. "I don't need to sit. I need to know what's happening." "Elena." His voice cracked with something raw, something that startled her. "Please, sit down. Let me handle this." She sat, more out of shock at his tone than obedience. Adrian pulled up a chair across from her, his eyes darting to the monitors, to the door, back to her face. "Talk to me," he said. "Tell me everything about the person warning you. Everything. It might be the only thing keeping us ahead of whoever's coming." Elena pressed her palms against her knees to stop them from shaking. "His name is Ray. At least that's what he told me 14 years ago. He was young then, mid-20s maybe, working under the marshal who actually got me out of Ohio. When the marshal retired, Ray kept checking on me. Unofficially. It's not supposed to happen that way, but he said he couldn't just let a 17-year-old girl disappear into the system and hope for the best." "Does he know you work here in this house?" "No." Elena shook her head firmly. "I never told him where I ended up. I never tell him anything specific. It's safer that way for both of us." "Then how does he know Grady recognized you 8 months ago?" The question hit Elena like cold water. She hadn't thought about it. Not really, not with everything else crashing down around her. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how he would know that unless..." Unless someone else told him, Adrian finished. Which means either your Marshall friend has eyes inside my organization, or the people hunting you have been watching you long enough that word got back to him through other channels. Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her. Or a third option, she said slowly, her stomach twisting. Ray isn't who I think he is anymore. Adrian's eyes sharpened. You think he's been compromised. I think 14 years is a long time. Elena said, her voice hollow. I think people change. I think money changes people faster than anything else. And I think the men who murdered my family have had 14 years and unlimited resources to find every single person who ever helped me disappear. The radio on Adrian's hip crackled to life. Marcus's voice tight and urgent. Adrian, we've got a problem. Adrian grabbed the radio. Talk. Camera 4's back online. Whoever cut it did it manually from inside the wine cellar access panel. That's not some outside hacker job, that's someone who knows the layout of this house. Elena's blood went cold. Someone who's been inside before. Or someone who works here. Adrian said grimly into the radio. Marcus, pull every staff member's access logs for the last 6 months. Cross-reference with anyone who had reason to be near that panel. On it. And Adrian. Marcus's voice hesitated for just a beat, an unusual pause for a man who never hesitated. You should know Harold Grady's car is parked 2 blocks from the estate. Been there for 40 minutes. Adrian's expression turned to stone. He never left. Looks that way. Bring him in, Adrian said. Quietly. I want to talk to him myself. And if he doesn't want to come quietly, Adrian's eyes flicked to Elena, taking in the fear still etched into every line of her face. The 14 years of terror that one man's carelessness had reignited in a single sentence at a party. Then make him, he said, and there was something in his voice that made Elena's skin prickle, a glimpse of the man his enemies feared. The radio clicked off. Silence pressed into the small room. You're going to hurt him, Elena said quietly. It wasn't a question. I'm going to get answers, Adrian said. How I get them depends entirely on how cooperative he decides to be. That's not an answer. Adrian looked at her, something conflicted flashing across his face. 14 years ago, men like Grady helped erase your entire family and let you carry that alone as a child. I am not going to lose sleep over how uncomfortable his evening becomes tonight. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to cling to some version of morality that made sense in a normal world. But nothing about tonight was normal, and some exhausted, wounded part of her that had buried a mother and father before she'd even graduated high school found she couldn't summon the energy to defend a man who had laughed about her family's murder over cocktails. Just don't let him die before he talks, she said instead, her voice flat. I've waited 14 years for someone to actually answer for what happened. I don't want him getting the easy way out. Something shifted in Adrian's expression, a flicker of surprise, maybe even respect. Understood. They waited in tense silence for nearly 20 minutes. Adrian's eyes flicking constantly between the monitors and Elena's face, as if he were afraid she might shatter if he looked away too long. The radio finally crackled again. We've got him, Marcus said. Wasn't happy about it, but he came. He's in the East Wing study. Bring Elena and me down through the servants' passage, Adrian said. I don't want him seeing her yet, not until I know what he's willing to say without that pressure. They moved through a narrow, dimly lit corridor Elena had cleaned 100 times, but never truly noticed servant hallways built decades ago to keep the help invisible, even inside their own workplace. Tonight, that invisibility felt like protection instead of erasure. They arrived at a small alcove with a one-way mirror overlooking the study, an old security feature Elena hadn't known existed. Through the glass, she saw Harold Grady sitting stiffly in a leather chair, sweat visible on his forehead despite the room's cool temperature, 2 of Adrian's security men flanking the door. He looks terrified, Elena murmured. Good, Adrian said. Terrified men talk. He stepped out of the alcove and into the study, closing the door behind him with a soft final click. Elena pressed closer to the glass, watching her pulse hammering. Harold. Adrian said, his voice smooth, almost friendly, the tone Elena imagined he used before destroying business rivals over dinner. Good of you to come back. Adrian, I don't know what this is about. I was just leaving when your men. You were parked 2 blocks away for 40 minutes, Harold. Adrian's voice didn't rise, but something underneath it hardened like steel. Men who are simply leaving parties don't sit outside for 40 minutes. Men who are waiting for something do that. Grady's face went gray. I don't know what you're talking about. Let's talk about last night instead. Adrian said, settling into the chair across from him with unnerving calm. You were at the bar. You mentioned a family. The Bennetts. Said something about a mess that got cleaned up nicely. I'd like you to tell me more about that. Elena watched Grady's entire body go rigid. I was drunk, Grady stammered. I don't even remember saying that. I remember, Adrian said quietly. And so does my housekeeper, who happened to be standing right next to you when you said it. Adrian, whatever you think this is, Charles Whitfield. Adrian said, cutting him off, and the name landed in the room like a gunshot. Grady flinched visibly. You've known him for over 20 years. He was investigated 14 years ago for bribery connected to a murder case involving a family named Bennett, a husband, a wife, and a teenage daughter who was never found. I had nothing to do with that, Grady said quickly, too quickly. I didn't say you did, Adrian said calmly. I said you knew about it, and I want to know exactly what you know and exactly who else knows, because it appears that girl is not as dead as everyone assumed 14 years ago. Behind the glass, Elena's stomach dropped. He'd just confirmed everything. Grady's face crumpled, panic overtaking whatever calculation had been holding his composure together. You don't understand what you're getting into, he whispered. Whitfield isn't just some old friend of your father's. He built half his fortune covering up things people paid him to cover up, your father included. Adrian went very still. Explain that. Your father, Grady said, his voice shaking now, paid Whitfield to make 4 building inspectors disappear from the record after they refused to certify unsafe structures. Whitfield's people made those inspectors' objections vanish, made the paperwork clean, made the buildings pass. And when the Bennett man found the payment trail and threatened to go to the FBI, Whitfield handled that too. Handled it how? Adrian said, though Elena could see even from behind the glass that he already knew that he was forcing Grady to say it out loud to make it real and undeniable. He had him killed, Grady whispered. Him, his wife. The daughter disappeared before they could finish the job. Everyone assumed she died somewhere along the way. Off the grid, dead in a ditch, whatever. Nobody looked very hard because nobody wanted to find her. Until 8 months ago, Adrian said, when you recognized her. Grady's silence was answer enough. Who did you tell, Harold? Nobody, Grady said, but his eyes darted sideways, and Elena, watching through the glass, felt her stomach twist violently. He was lying. Harold. Adrian leaned forward, his voice dropping to something dangerously soft. I am asking you one more time, and I promise you the version of tonight where you tell me the truth right now is significantly more pleasant than the version where I find out on my own. Grady's composure finally broke completely. I told Whitfield, he blurted out. 8 months ago, I saw her at some charity thing you dragged your housekeepers to serving drinks, and I recognized her from an old photo Whitfield kept. God knows why, he still had it, some sick trophy, I guess. And I told him because I thought he'd want to know. I thought maybe there'd be a reward. I didn't think. You didn't think, Adrian repeated coldly. I didn't think he'd still care after 14 years. Grady's voice cracked. I thought it was ancient history. I didn't know he'd still want her found. But he does? Adrian said. He's been looking for her for 8 months. Grady admitted, his voice barely audible now. Quietly. Through people who don't ask questions. I don't know what he found. I swear to you, Adrian, I don't know anything more than that. Adrian sat back slowly, his expression unreadable, though Elena, watching through the glass, could see the fury simmering just beneath the surface, controlled but unmistakable. One more question, Adrian said. Is Whitfield here tonight in Chicago? Or did he send someone else to finish what he started 14 years ago? Grady's face went white as paper. He's here, he whispered. He flew in 3 days ago. I don't know why, I swear, I don't know why, but he's here. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She stumbled back from the glass, her hand flying to her mouth, 14 years of buried terror surging up through her chest all at once. The man who had ordered her parents' murder, the man whose name she'd only ever whispered in nightmares, was in the same city, possibly even now closing in on the house where she'd hidden for 8 years, believing herself safe. Adrian emerged from the study minutes later, his face a mask of controlled rage, and found Elena pressed against the wall of the alcove, breathing hard, her whole body trembling. Elena? He reached for her, then stopped himself, remembering how she'd reacted the last time. Elena, look at me. She forced her eyes up to his face, tears finally breaking free and sliding down her cheeks. He's here, she whispered. He's actually here. I know, Adrian said, his voice grim but steady. And I am not going to let him get anywhere near you. Do you understand me? Not after everything you've survived to make it this far. You don't know what he's capable of, Elena said, her voice breaking. You don't know what these people do to loose ends. I have some idea, Adrian said darkly. My father was apparently one of them. The radio at Adrian's hip crackled again, urgent this time. Adrian, Marcus's voice tight with tension. We've got a visitor at the front gate. Says he's an old friend of the family. Says his name is Charles Whitfield. The words dropped like a stone into still water, and Elena felt the entire world tilt sideways beneath her feet. He's here right now, she breathed. Adrian's face hardened into something Elena had never seen from him before, something cold and absolute. Let him in, he said into the radio, his eyes never leaving Elena's terrified face. I want to look this man in the eye myself. Adrian, are you sure that's... Let him in, Marcus. Adrian's voice left no room for argument. It's time Charles Whitfield realized exactly whose house he walked into tonight. Elena grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his suit jacket with desperate strength. If you let him see me, if he knows I'm still here, he will never stop coming for me. You have to hide me, please. Adrian looked down at her hand on his arm, then up into her terrified eyes, and something in his expression softened, even as his jaw remained set with fury. I'm not hiding you, he said quietly. Not this time. You've been hiding for 14 years, Elena, and it never once made you safe. I think it's time Whitfield realized the girl he thought he erased is standing right here in my house under my protection, and if he wants to finish what he started, he's going to have to go through me first. Adrian, that's insane. He'll what? Adrian's voice was quiet, dangerous. Try something in my own home, surrounded by my own men. Let him try. I've spent my whole life underestimating exactly what my father's world was built on. I am done being blind to it. Before Elena could argue further, footsteps echoed from the main hallway. Unhurried, confident, the footsteps of a man who had walked into rooms full of danger for decades and never once feared the outcome. Charles Whitfield appeared at the end of the corridor, silver-haired, impeccably dressed. A warm smile stretched across a face that Elena recognized instantly from 14 years of nightmares. A face she had only ever seen in a single stolen glance through a crack in a garage wall as a terrified 17-year-old girl. His eyes swept the hallway, landing first on Adrian and then inevitably on Elena, standing frozen just behind him. The warm smile faltered for exactly 1 second, a single flicker of shock breaking through decades of practiced composure before it slid smoothly back into place. Well, Whitfield said softly, his voice carrying easily down the corridor, calm and almost pleasant, as though he were greeting an old acquaintance at a dinner party rather than a woman he'd spent 14 years trying to erase from existence. I have to say, Sophia, you've gotten very good at disappearing. Elena's entire body went rigid, every nightmare of the last 14 years crystallizing into this single unbearable moment, standing in a hallway with the man who had destroyed her family. No walls left to hide behind, no name left to disappear into. But not good enough, it seems. Whitfield continued, his eyes gliding coldly over to Adrian, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. "Adrian, I had no idea you'd developed such a soft spot for the help. Your father would be very disappointed." "My father," Adrian said, stepping forward, his voice low and lethal, "is dead. And whatever loyalty I owed to his memory died the moment I learned what he let you do to an innocent family." Whitfield's smile didn't waver, but something calculating flickered behind his eyes. "Careful, Adrian. You're a smart young man. Smart enough to know that some doors once opened can never be closed again. Are you absolutely certain you want to open this one?" "I already have," Adrian said. Whitfield's gaze slid back to Elena, lingering, assessing the same predatory patience she remembered from a single terrified glance 14 years ago. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, almost gently, "we should talk about exactly what happens next." And behind him, unnoticed by anyone in that tense, charged hallway, a second figure stepped quietly through the front door. Whitfield had left standing open, moving with the silent precision of a man who had done this kind of work many times, before his hand already reaching beneath his jacket. Marcus saw the second man first catching the movement in his peripheral vision from where he stood near the security console, and his training took over before his mind even finished processing the threat. "Gun!" he shouted, already moving, already reaching for Adrian. The next 3 seconds happened in fragments Elena would replay for the rest of her life. Marcus slamming into Adrian's side, knocking him sideways, just as the stranger's hand cleared his jacket. Whitfield spinning toward the noise, his composed mask finally cracking into genuine alarm. Elena's own body freezing solid, every survival instinct she'd built over 14 years betraying her at the exact moment she needed them most. The gunshot cracked through the hallway like thunder. Marcus grunted and staggered, one hand flying to his shoulder, dark red already blooming beneath his fingers, but he didn't go down. He didn't even slow. He drove his own weight into the shooter, and the two men crashed into an antique table that shattered beneath them, sending porcelain and glass exploding across the floor. "Elena down!" Adrian's voice cut through the chaos, and then his arm was around her, dragging her behind the thick oak doorframe of the study as 2 more of his security men came pouring into the hallway, weapons drawn. The shooter was on the ground within seconds. Marcus's forearm crushed against his throat, despite the blood soaking through his own shirt, and the security team swarmed to finish what Marcus had started, wrenching the gun free, pinning the man's arms behind his back with brutal efficiency. Whitfield stood frozen against the far wall, hands raised slightly, his composure finally completely gone. "That was not my doing," he said quickly, his voice higher than before, all trace of calm superiority erased. "I swear to you, Adrian, I came here alone. I had no idea." "Shut up!" Adrian snarled, his own weapon somehow already in his hand, leveled at Whitfield's chest, with a steadiness that made Elena's skin crawl. "Shut up right now, or I promise you the next bullet in this hallway comes from me." "Adrian, please think about what you're doing." "I am thinking very clearly," Adrian said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I'm thinking that a man walked into my house tonight with a gun 30 seconds after you did, and I am thinking that is not a coincidence anyone with a brain would believe." Elena, still pressed against the doorframe, watched Marcus force the shooter to his knees, blood dripping steadily from his shoulder wound onto the marble floor. The man's face was young, unfamiliar, his eyes darting wildly between Whitfield and the security men holding him. "Who sent you?" Marcus demanded, pressing his knee into the man's back despite his own injury, his voice tight with pain but utterly controlled. The man said nothing, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the floor. "Who sent you?" Marcus repeated each word sharper than the last. "I don't know anything," the man finally spat out. "I was just paid to follow the girl. Nobody said anything about tonight going bad. I was supposed to just watch and report." "Report to who?" Adrian's voice cracked like a whip. The man's eyes flickered involuntarily toward Whitfield, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Elena saw it. Adrian saw it. Even Whitfield saw the man's eyes betray him, and his own face went ashen. "I have never seen that man in my life," Whitfield said quickly, too quickly, his voice climbing toward panic. Adrian, I swear on everything I have. You're going to swear on something, Adrian said coldly, but I don't think it's going to save you. He turned to his security team. Get him out of my sight. Lock him in the wine cellar with the other one. I'll deal with both of them when I've calmed down enough not to kill them where they stand. Two men hauled the wounded shooter to his feet and dragged him away, leaving a trail of blood across the marble that made Elena's stomach twist violently. She had seen blood before. She had seen far worse than this as a 17-year-old girl hiding behind a water heater, listening to her father beg for his life. But something about tonight, about watching violence erupt in real time instead of replaying in nightmares, made her knees threaten to give out entirely. Adrian turned his weapon back toward Whitfield, his eyes burning with a fury Elena hadn't imagined a man like him capable of. Not this personal, not this raw. Sit down, Adrian said quietly. Adrian, I really think we should discuss this like reasonable. I said sit down. Adrian's voice cracked through the hallway like another gunshot, and Whitfield, despite decades of practiced power and control, sank slowly into a nearby chair, his hands visibly trembling now. Marcus staggered upright, pressing a hand hard against his bleeding shoulder, his face pale, but his eyes still sharp, still watching everything. I'm fine, he said before anyone could ask. Grazed me. Feels worse than it is. You're getting that looked at immediately, Adrian said without turning from Whitfield. After, Marcus said stubbornly. I want to hear what he has to say first. Elena finally forced herself to step out from behind the doorframe, her legs unsteady, but her spine straightening with something that felt for the first time in 14 years, dangerously close to courage. She walked slowly toward Whitfield, stopping just a few feet away, close enough that he had to look up at her, close enough that the 17-year-old girl, hiding in the dark, finally stood eye to eye with the monster who had destroyed her life. Do you remember my father's face? She asked quietly, her voice shaking but clear. When he begged you to think about his daughter. When he told you I was still just a kid, that I had nothing to do with any of it. Whitfield's eyes flickered up to hers, something unreadable crossing his features. Sophia, don't, she snapped, and the sharpness in her own voice surprised even her. Don't say that name like you have any right to it. You took my name from me 14 years ago. You took my parents, my home, every single normal thing a person is supposed to get to have. You don't get to say it back to me now like we're old friends catching up. I was following orders, Whitfield said. And something in his composure finally cracked entirely. Decades of careful control crumbling under the weight of a dead man's daughter, standing in front of him, very much alive. You have to understand, it wasn't personal. Your father found something that would have destroyed dozens of lives, powerful people, he found the truth. Elena said, her voice rising now, 14 years of grief, finally breaking free of the cage she'd built around it. He found out that your buildings were killing people, and he was going to do the right thing, and you murdered him for it. You murdered my mother 2 days later. You tried to murder me. There is no version of that story where you get to call it business. Whitfield's mouth opened then closed again, no words coming. Whose orders? Adrian said quietly, stepping closer, his weapon still steady in his hand. You said you were following orders. Whose? Whitfield's eyes darted between Elena and Adrian, calculation warring visibly with fear. A man used to controlling every room he entered, suddenly finding himself with no good options left. Your father's... Whitfield finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words landed like a physical blow. Adrian's face went white, then hard as stone. I already knew that, Adrian said, his voice dangerously quiet. I want to know who else. I want every single name of everyone still alive who had a hand in destroying this family. If I tell you, Whitfield said, some of his old cunning returning, even through the fear, you understand what that means. You understand the men on that list. Judges, senators, people who could end your entire operation with a single phone call if they knew I gave you their names. And if you don't tell me, Adrian said, leaning down until his face was inches from Whitfield's, I'm going to let her decide what happens to you instead. And I don't think, after 14 years, she's going to be particularly merciful. Whitfield's eyes flicked to Elena, and whatever he saw in her face in that moment, cold and unflinching, and finally unafraid, seemed to break something loose in him. "Marcus Reeves," he said quickly. "City councilman back then. He's a state senator now. He approved the zoning waivers that let the buildings pass without proper inspection." Diane Colton. She was the building commissioner. She's retired now, but she's the one who actually falsified the inspection records. And, he hesitated. "And," Adrian pressed. "And Frank Delgado," Whitfield said quietly. "Your father's lawyer. He's the one who structured the payments so they'd never be traced. He still handles your family's legal affairs. I believe he handled the paperwork for your mother's estate just last year." Adrian went completely still, and Elena watched something break behind his eyes, a final illusion about his own family, shattering into pieces. Frank Delgado had been at Adrian's father's funeral. Frank Delgado had sat in Adrian's own study a dozen times over the years, advising him, guiding him, a trusted fixture of the Voss family, for as long as Adrian could remember. "He's still working for me," Adrian said, his voice hollow. "Yes," Whitfield confirmed quietly. "He never stopped." The radio at Adrian's hip crackled again, and this time it was a different voice, one of the security men stationed at the front gate. "Sir, we've got another vehicle approaching. Black sedan moving fast." Adrian's head snapped up, every muscle in his body tensing. "Who is it?" "Can't tell yet, sir, but it's not slowing down for the gate." "Lock it down!" Adrian shouted into the radio. "Nobody comes through that gate without my direct authorization." But it was already too late. Through the tall windows lining the front hallway, headlights swept violently across the driveway, and the black sedan didn't stop at the gate at all. It crashed straight through the wrought iron barrier with a shriek of tearing metal tires, screeching against gravel as it barreled up the long driveway toward the house. "Get down!" Adrian shouted, grabbing Elena and hauling her bodily behind the reinforced wall of the study, as gunfire erupted outside, security men scrambling to return fire against whoever had just breached the estate's outer perimeter. Whitfield scrambled out of his chair in a panic, trying to flee toward the back of the house, but one of Adrian's remaining security men grabbed him roughly and shoved him to the floor, weapon drawn, covering the hallway. "Stay down," the guard barked. Elena crouched against the study wall, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her ears, watching Adrian peer carefully around the doorframe toward the chaos erupting outside. Gunfire echoed across the estate grounds, shouts, the screech of tires, the shattering of glass somewhere near the front entrance. "This is not what I planned," Whitfield said desperately from the floor, and for the first time Elena believed him because the panic in his voice was too raw, too genuine to be another performance. "Adrian, I swear to you I did not send that car." "Then who did?" Adrian snapped, not taking his eyes off the chaos beyond the doorway. Whitfield's face had gone the color of ash. "There's someone else," he whispered. "Someone I answer to. Someone who's been managing this situation from the very beginning, long before tonight." Elena's blood ran cold. "Someone else," she repeated. "There's someone above you." Whitfield nodded slowly, his eyes wide with genuine terror now. 14 years ago, I wasn't the one who gave the order to kill your father," he said. "I was the one who carried it out. But the order came from someone far more powerful than me. Someone who has spent 14 years making absolutely certain that no one ever finds out he was involved." "Who?" Elena demanded, her voice shaking violently now. Before Whitfield could answer, the gunfire outside intensified, and through the chaos, Elena heard Marcus's voice shouting orders, heard the security team pushing back against whatever force had just crashed through the estate's gates, and beneath all of it, beneath the screaming and the gunfire, and 14 years of buried terror finally erupting into violent, undeniable reality. Elena heard something that made her entire world tilt sideways. A voice amplified through some kind of megaphone or speaker calm and horribly, impossibly familiar, carrying easily across the chaos of the estate grounds. "Sophia Bennett," the voice called out, warm and almost gentle, the way you might call to a frightened child hiding in the dark. It's been a very long time. I think it's time we finally talked face to face. Elena's entire body went numb. She knew that voice. She had heard it only once before 14 years ago, in the seconds before everything in her life had been destroyed, a voice she had spent 14 years trying to forget, and had never not, for one single day, succeeded. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "That voice belongs to a dead man." Oh. Adrian turned to look at her, his face etched with confusion and alarm. "What are you talking about? Whose voice is that?" Elena's whole body was shaking now, 14 years of certainty collapsing in an instant, the foundation of everything she thought she knew about that terrible night crumbling beneath her. "That's my father's business partner," she said, her voice breaking completely. "Thomas Reed. He died in a car accident 6 years after my parents. Everyone said it was an accident. I went to his memorial service under a fake name just to make sure, just to be certain he wasn't part of what happened to my family. And," Adrian pressed. "And I was wrong," Elena whispered, staring out toward the chaos beyond the doorway, toward a voice that should not exist, belonging to a man who should have been dead for 8 years. "He's alive. He's been alive this entire time. And I think," she said, her voice dropping to something barely above a breath, "I think he's the one who's been pulling every string for 14 years. Whitfield, still crouched on the floor, made a small broken sound, something between a laugh and a sob. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "how deep this actually goes." Outside, the gunfire suddenly stopped, an abrupt, unnatural silence falling over the estate grounds. And into that silence, the amplified voice spoke again, closer, now close enough that Elena could hear the smile in it. "Adrian." Thomas Reed called out, his tone almost conversational, almost warm. "I think it's time you and I had a very long overdue conversation about your father, my old business, and exactly what that girl standing behind you is actually worth to a great many powerful people." Adrian's hand tightened around his weapon, his eyes meeting Elena's in the sudden silence, and in that single terrified glance, they both understood the same devastating truth. Whatever had happened tonight, whatever they thought they'd uncovered, they had only scratched the surface of something far larger, far older, and far more dangerous than either of them had ever imagined. "Stay behind me," Adrian said quietly, moving toward the shattered front entrance where moonlight spilled across broken glass and a man's silhouette stood waiting in the driveway, utterly unafraid, utterly confident, a ghost who had spent 14 years controlling every move in a game Elena hadn't even known she was still playing. And as Adrian stepped toward the door, weapon raised, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. 14 years of hiding, finally giving way to something else entirely. Something that felt, for the first time since she was 17 years old, dangerously close to fury. She was done being afraid of ghosts. Elena grabbed Adrian's arm before he could take another step toward the doorway. "Wait," she said, her voice shaking but urgent. "If that's really Thomas Reed out there, he's not going to just talk. Men like him don't resurface after 14 years to have a friendly conversation. He's here because he thinks he's already won." "Then we make sure he's wrong," Adrian said, though something in his eyes betrayed the same fear gripping her chest. "Adrian?" Marcus's voice cut through the tension, sharp with pain, but steady as he limped into view from the side hallway, one hand still pressed hard against his bleeding shoulder, the other holding his weapon low and ready. "Whoever's out there, they stopped shooting the second they realized we had eyes on every angle. That's not surrender. That's a man making sure he gets to say his piece before anything else happens." "How many men does he have with him?" Adrian asked. "3 that we can see," Marcus said. "Could be more in the tree line. We took down the driver of that sedan, but Reed himself is standing in the open, like he doesn't have a single reason to be afraid." "Because he doesn't?" Elena said quietly, staring toward the broken doorway, toward the voice that had haunted her nightmares for 14 years. "Men like him never think the walls will actually close in. Not until it's far too late." Adrian turned to her, his expression hardening with resolve. "Then let's be the thing that closes in." He stepped through the shattered entrance, first weapon raised, and Elena followed a half step behind him, despite every instinct screaming at her to run in the opposite direction. The night air hit her face cold and sharp, and there, standing calmly in the wreckage of the estate's front gate, illuminated by the headlights of the crashed sedan, stood a man Elena had spent 14 years believing was buried in a cemetery outside Cleveland. Thomas Reed looked older than she remembered, gray now, instead of the dark brown hair from her childhood memories. But his face was unmistakable, the same calm, unreadable expression that had haunted the edges of her nightmares since she was 17 years old. "Sophia," he said warmly, as though greeting a long-lost relative rather than a woman he had spent over a decade trying to erase. "Look at you, all grown up. Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become, even if you did have to become someone else entirely to survive it." "Don't," Elena said, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Talk about my father. You don't get to say his name." "I loved your father," Reed said, and something in his voice actually sounded genuine, which somehow made it worse. "We built that business together from nothing. He was like a brother to me." "You had him killed," Elena said, her voice cracking. "You had my mother killed. You spent 14 years hunting a teenage girl because she saw something she wasn't supposed to see." Reed's expression shifted, something almost like regret, passing briefly across his face, before hardening back into calm control. "Business is a brutal thing, Sophia. Your father found something that would have destroyed everything I'd built, everything dozens of families depended on for their livelihoods. I didn't make that choice easily." "You murdered 2 people," Adrian said, stepping forward, his voice cold with restrained fury. "There's no version of easy in that." Reed's eyes shifted to Adrian, something calculating flickering behind them. "Ah, the sun. I wondered when you'd finally figure out what your father really was underneath all that polish." His voice took on an almost teacherly quality, patient and condescending. "Your father and I built an empire on the bones of people who couldn't survive knowing certain truths, Adrian. You've been living off the profits of that empire your entire life. Don't stand there now pretending your hands are clean." "My hands were never in this," Adrian said. "But they will be tonight when I finish what you started." Reed actually laughed, a soft, unsettling sound. "You think this ends with you shooting me in your own driveway? Do you have any idea how many people would come looking for answers if Thomas Reed disappeared tonight? Senators? Federal judges? Men who have spent 14 years protecting this secret because their own careers depend on it staying buried. Marcus Reeves," Elena said, suddenly remembering the name Whitfield had given them. "Diane Colton, Frank Delgado." Reed's composed expression finally cracked, just slightly surprise flickering across his features. "You've been busy. We know everyone." Elena said, her voice growing steadier with every word, 14 years of fear finally beginning to transform into something else entirely. "We know what you did. We know who helped you do it. And we know exactly why you're standing in this driveway tonight, instead of hiding wherever you've been hiding for the last 14 years. You're not here because you think you can win. You're here because you're desperate." Something flickered behind Reed's eyes, and for the briefest moment, Elena saw it, the crack in his armor she'd been searching for her entire adult life. Fear. "You don't know anything," Reed said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I know Whitfield is inside right now on the floor, terrified, telling us everything he knows because he realizes exactly how badly tonight went for all of you." Elena pressed. "I know that flash drive my father made 14 years ago is still around my neck, and everything on it. Every payment, every name, every falsified inspection, it's all still there waiting for the right moment." Reed's face went pale in the harsh glow of the headlights. "That drive was destroyed," he said, his voice tight. "We searched that house for weeks after your father died. There was nothing." "You searched the wrong house," Elena said quietly. "My father gave it to me the night before he died. I've carried it every single day for 14 years, too afraid to use it, too afraid of exactly this moment. But I'm not afraid anymore." "Sophia, think very carefully about what you're threatening," Reed said, his composure slipping further, his voice sharpening with real urgency now. "If that drive becomes public, it doesn't just destroy me. It destroys a state senator's career, ends a decorated commissioner's legacy, and buries Frank Delgado, a man who has represented half the powerful families in this city for 30 years. Do you understand the kind of chaos that unleashes? Do you understand how many people would want you silenced permanently the moment that information surfaces? I understand it a lot better than you think, Elena said, tears finally breaking free and sliding down her face, though her voice never wavered. I've spent 14 years living with the consequences of what happens when powerful men decide the truth is inconvenient. I'm done being afraid of what happens if people finally hear it. The radio at Marcus's hip crackled suddenly, and one of the perimeter guards' voices came through tense and urgent. Sir, we've got 2 more vehicles approaching from the South Road. Moving fast. Reed's face split into something that might have been triumph if it weren't so obviously strained. That would be the rest of my associates, he said. I told you, Adrian, this does not end tonight the way you think it does. Get inside, Adrian said sharply to Elena, but she shook her head fiercely. No, she said. I have spent 14 years hiding while other people decided what happened to my life. I am not hiding from this. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and protective and deeply conflicted warring in his eyes before he gave a single tight nod. Then stay behind me, please. The headlights of the approaching vehicles swept across the driveway as they crested the hill leading to the estate, and Elena's heart pounded as she counted them. Not 2 cars of hired guns as Reed had implied. 4 black SUVs moving in formation with something painted on the side that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Those are federal vehicles, Marcus said, disbelief coloring his voice. Reed spun around so fast he nearly stumbled, his composed mask shattering completely as the SUVs screeched to a halt around the destroyed gate, doors flying open, agents pouring out with weapons drawn and badges raised. FBI, nobody move. Reed's face went the color of ash. This isn't possible, he whispered. I have people. I have protection. There's no way. Thomas Reed, a woman's voice called out sharp and authoritative, as a tall agent in a dark jacket strode forward, flanked by 4 other agents. You're under arrest for the murders of David and Karen Bennett, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and about a dozen other charges we're going to enjoy adding to that list. Elena stood frozen, disbelief flooding through her exhausted body as she watched agents swarm past her toward Reed, who was staring at her now with something like betrayed confusion. How? Reed demanded, his voice cracking. How did they know to come here tonight? I called them, said a voice from behind Elena, and she turned to see Rosa, the young kitchen staffer, standing in the doorway with a phone still clutched in her hand, her face pale but resolute. I heard the gunshots. I called 911, but when I mentioned the names Whitfield and Bennett, they patched me straight through to someone who already had a task force working this case. The lead agent approached Elena slowly, her expression softening slightly as she took in the exhaustion and terror written across the younger woman's face. Sophia Bennett, she asked gently. Elena's whole body trembled at the sound of her real name spoken aloud by a stranger, spoken not as a threat, but as a question, an acknowledgement that she existed, that she had always existed, even beneath 14 years of careful lies. Yes, she whispered. That's me. My name is Special Agent Diane Marsh, the woman said. I've been working the Bennett case for the last 3 years, ever since new information surfaced connecting Thomas Reed's supposed death to a series of suspicious financial transactions. We've been building a case against Reed, Whitfield, and several others for a long time. We just needed enough evidence to move. The flash drive, Elena breathed. You need the flash drive. Agent Marsh's eyes flickered with something like hope. You have it. Elena reached beneath her collar with trembling fingers and pulled out the thin silver chain, the small flash drive swinging in the cold night air. 14 years of buried truth, finally ready to see daylight. I've had it this whole time, she said, tears streaming freely now. I was too afraid to use it. I thought it would get me killed. It very well might have years ago, Agent Marsh said gently. But tonight, it's going to put away every single person who destroyed your family. Behind them, agents were already cuffing Reed, who had gone completely silent, his earlier confidence replaced by hollow, defeated shock. Two more agents emerged from a separate vehicle, escorting a handcuffed man Elena recognized with a jolt as Frank Delgado, Adrian's family lawyer, his face ashen and his eyes darting nervously toward Adrian with something like desperate pleading. "Adrian," Delgado called out. "Adrian, please, you have to understand your father. Get him out of my sight." Adrian said, his voice flat and cold, turning away before Delgado could say another word. Marcus finally allowed one of the paramedics who had arrived with the federal convoy to examine his shoulder, wincing as they cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. But his eyes remained fixed on the scene unfolding across the driveway on Elena, standing tall for the first time since Adrian had known her, watching the man who destroyed her childhood being led away in handcuffs. "It's really happening," Elena whispered mostly to herself, disbelief flooding every word. 14 years, and it's actually happening. Adrian stepped closer to her, his voice gentle now, stripped of the cold fury he'd carried moments before. "You did this," he said quietly. "Not me. Not the FBI. You survived 14 years carrying a secret that could have gotten you killed at any moment, and tonight you were brave enough to use it." "I almost didn't," Elena admitted, her voice breaking. "If Grady hadn't recognized me, if none of this had happened tonight, I might have carried that drive to my grave, too afraid to ever use it." "But you didn't," Adrian said. "And because of that, an entire network of people who thought they were untouchable are about to learn exactly how wrong they were." Agent Marsh approached again, her expression professional but not unkind. "Ms. Bennett, we're going to need you to come in for a full statement, and we'll need that drive processed as evidence immediately. I want you to know, given the scope of what you're about to help us uncover, we can offer you protection, real protection this time, not just a new name and a prayer." Elena laughed, a broken, exhausted sound that carried 14 years of accumulated grief and fear finally beginning to lift. "I don't need to disappear anymore," she said. "I'm done disappearing." Whitfield was brought out next, still in handcuffs, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who understood his entire carefully constructed world had just ended. As agents guided him past Elena toward one of the waiting vehicles, he paused, turning to look at her one final time. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I am sorry for what happened to your family. I told myself for 14 years it was just business. I don't think I believed that even then." Elena stared at him for a long moment. 14 years of rage and grief warring inside her chest before she finally spoke. "Sorry doesn't bring my parents back," she said. "But maybe it's a start toward you finally telling the truth about everyone else involved." Whitfield's eyes flickered with something like resignation. "I'll tell them everything," he said. "Reeves, Colton, Delgado, all of it. There's no reason left to protect any of them." As the agents led him away, Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a weight she had carried for 14 years, beginning finally to lift. The next several hours passed in a blur of federal agent statements and evidence collection. Elena sat in the back of an ambulance as a paramedic checked her over for shock, watching the chaotic aftermath unfold across the estate grounds. Adrian never more than a few feet away, his earlier fury settling into something quieter, more contemplative. "You've been staring at me for the last 20 minutes, Elena said eventually, managing a small, exhausted smile. "I'm trying to figure out how to apologize," Adrian admitted, "for something my father did before I was even old enough to understand what kind of man he really was." "You don't have to apologize for him," Elena said. "You already proved tonight that you're not him. You chose the truth over protecting your own family's name. That's not nothing, Adrian. That's everything." "It doesn't undo 14 years of your life," he said quietly. "No," Elena agreed. "But it means the next 14 years don't have to look like the last ones." Agent Marsh returned as the sun began to rise over the estate, exhaustion evident in her own face, after a night that had clearly upended months of careful investigative planning. "The drive checked out," she said. "Everything your father documented: financial records, falsified inspection reports, correspondence between Reed and Whitfield. It's more than enough to bring charges against everyone involved, including Senator Reeves and former Commissioner Colton. What happens now? Elena asked. Now we build the case properly, Agent Marsh said. You'll need to testify eventually, but we have enough independent corroboration between Whitfield's confession and the drive's contents that your testimony will be supporting evidence, not the sole foundation of the case. You won't be as exposed as you might think. Relief flooded through Elena's exhausted body, so profound it nearly brought her to tears again. I won't have to disappear again, she said, even after the trial. No, Agent Marsh confirmed. This time, the people who should be afraid are the ones going to prison. As Agent Marsh walked away to continue coordinating with the swarm of agents processing the scene, Adrian settled onto the back edge of the ambulance beside Elena, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. What will you do now? He asked quietly. Once all of this settles, all. Elena considered the question for a long moment, watching the pale morning light spread slowly across the estate grounds, illuminating the wreckage of the previous night. The shattered gate, the broken glass. The visible evidence of 14 years finally coming to a violent, necessary reckoning. I don't know, she admitted. I've spent so long planning how to disappear that I never once let myself think about what it would look like to actually stay somewhere, to actually build something that lasts. You could stay here, Adrian said, his voice careful, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to the commanding authority she'd watched him wield all night. Not as staff, not as someone hiding, just stay, if you wanted to. Elena studied his face, searching for calculation, for the kind of hidden agenda she'd learned to expect from every powerful man she'd ever encountered, and found only quiet, genuine sincerity. That's a strange thing to offer someone whose family's tragedy is directly connected to yours, she said softly. Maybe, Adrian said. Or maybe it's exactly the reason it makes sense. We're both standing in the wreckage of what our fathers built. Seems like the kind of thing two people should face together rather than alone. Elena felt something shift in her chest, something that had been frozen solid for 14 years, finally beginning to thaw, cautious and fragile, but undeniably real. I'd like that, she said quietly. I think for the first time in a very long time, I'd genuinely like that. Marcus approached them, then his shoulder now properly bandaged, his face pale, but his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who had survived a night that could have ended very differently. Adrian, he said, Reeves and Colton have both already been picked up. Delgado's lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea deal. Apparently, he's ready to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. Let him cooperate, Adrian said. The more names that come out, the better. There's something else. Marcus added, his expression turning more serious. Word's already starting to spread through the organization about what happened tonight. Some of the older members, the ones who were loyal to your father, specifically, they're not going to be happy when they learn the full extent of what he did. Adrian's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Then they can leave, he said. I'm not interested in running an organization built on the kind of secrets that got an innocent family murdered. If that means restructuring everything my father built from the ground up, then that's exactly what we're going to do. Elena watched him say the words, watched the conviction behind them, and felt something settle inside her chest that she hadn't expected to feel again after 14 years of running. Trust. Fragile, new, uncertain trust, but trust nonetheless. As the morning sun climbed higher over the wreckage of the Voss estate, federal agents continuing their careful work across the grounds. Elena Marlowe, who had spent 14 years being nobody, finally allowed herself to imagine a future where Sophia Bennett didn't have to stay buried anymore, where the truth her father died protecting could finally step into the light without fear of who might be waiting in the shadows to silence it. She was still afraid. Some fears she suspected would take a very long time to fully release their grip. But for the first time since she was 17 years old, hiding behind a water heater while her father's life ended in the next room, Elena Marlowe felt something that had been missing from her life for 14 long years. Hope. 3 weeks passed before Elena set foot inside a courtroom, and every single one of those days felt like walking on ice that might crack beneath her at any moment. She stayed at the estate in a proper guest room now, instead of the small quarters above the garage. Though the transition still felt strange, like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else. Adrian gave her space, checking in every evening, sitting with her sometimes in silence, while she stared out at the grounds still bearing scars from that night. The repaired gate, a constant reminder of how close everything had come to ending in blood instead of justice. "You don't have to keep checking on me," Elena told him one evening, though her voice carried no real protest. "I know," Adrian said, settling into the chair across from her. "I want to." Agent Marsh visited twice that first week, walking Elena through what to expect, preparing her for the reality that testifying against powerful men rarely unfolded cleanly, no matter how strong the evidence. Frank Delgado's lawyers are pushing hard for a plea deal, Marsh explained during her second visit, spreading a folder across the kitchen table where Elena now took most of her meals with Rosa and the rest of the staff, who had once treated her as invisible and now treated her like something between a ghost and a hero. "He's offering full cooperation against Reeves and Colton in exchange for a reduced sentence. Given the scope of what he can provide, we're seriously considering it." "And Whitfield?" Elena asked. "Whitfield's confession has already been corroborated by 3 separate financial trails on that drive your father made," Marsh said. "He's looking at decades regardless of how cooperative he continues to be. Reed is refusing to speak at all, which honestly works in our favor. His silence looks exactly like what it is." "Guilt," Elena said quietly. "Guilt," Marsh confirmed. But it was Senator Marcus Reeves who proved to be the most dangerous variable in the weeks that followed, a man with decades of political capital and a network of allies who had no intention of watching his career collapse without a fight. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a story leaked to a local paper painting Elena not as a survivor, but as an unstable woman with a documented history of psychiatric treatment, conveniently omitting the fact that any such treatment, real or fabricated, had occurred under an assumed identity created specifically to survive a childhood trauma orchestrated by the very people now trying to discredit her. "They're trying to destroy your credibility before you ever say a word under oath," Adrian said grimly, reading the article on his phone while Elena sat across from him, her hands trembling with a fury she hadn't felt in weeks. "Of course they are," she said. "That's what powerful men do when the truth doesn't work in their favor anymore. They don't fight the facts. They attack the person holding them." "We fight back," Adrian said immediately. "How?" Elena's voice cracked with exhaustion. "I don't have decades of political favors to call in, Adrian. I don't have a network of loyal allies. I have a flash drive and 14 years of hiding." "You have something they don't," Adrian said quietly. "You have the truth, and you have people now who are not going to let you fight this alone." That promise was tested 2 days later when Elena received a call from a blocked number, her prepaid phone buzzing in the middle of the night with a voice she didn't recognize. Calm and clinical, delivering a message that made her blood run cold. "Ms. Bennett," the voice said, "I represent parties who would very much prefer this matter resolved quietly before things become significantly more complicated for you and your new associates. There's still time to reconsider testifying. There's still time to disappear again, the way you always have. We can make that very comfortable for you." Elena hung up without responding, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone, and immediately called Agent Marsh, who arrived at the estate within the hour with a forensics team to trace the call. "It came from a burner," Marsh confirmed grimly the next morning. "Untraceable, purchased with cash. But the message is clear. Someone with resources is trying to intimidate you into silence before trial." "They're offering me money to disappear," Elena said, disbelief coloring her voice. "After everything, they think I'll just take a payoff and vanish." "They're testing you," Marsh said, "seeing how much pressure it takes before you break. Don't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Every attempt they make to intimidate you only strengthens our case that you're a credible threat to powerful people who have every reason to want you silenced." Adrian, who had been standing silently in the doorway, listening to the entire exchange, stepped forward with something hard and protective, settled into his expression. "I'm assigning additional security to Elena immediately," he said. "Not staff, my own people, around the clock." "Adrian, that's not necessary." "It absolutely is necessary," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "Elena, someone just threatened you in the middle of the night. I am not debating this." She didn't argue further, some exhausted part of her grateful, despite 14 years of learning, never to depend on anyone else for her own safety, that someone finally wanted to stand between her and the darkness, instead of simply hoping she'd survive it alone. The threats didn't stop there. A week before the trial was set to begin, Rosa came running into the kitchen one morning, her face pale, clutching her phone. "Elena, you need to see this," she said, voice shaking. It was a video, grainy and clearly filmed from a distance, showing Elena walking across the estate grounds 3 days earlier, her face clearly visible, a timestamp confirming the exact date and location. The caption beneath it, posted anonymously to several local news forums, read simply, "The woman testifying against Senator Reeves has been living under a Mafia boss's protection for months. Ask yourself whose story you actually believe. They're trying to paint you as compromised." Adrian set his jaw tight with fury as he read the caption over Elena's shoulder. "Making it look like your testimony is being manufactured by criminal interests instead of coming from an actual survivor." "It's working," Elena said quietly, watching the comment count climb rapidly beneath the video. Strangers online, already debating her credibility, her sanity, her motives. People who knew nothing about 14 years of hiding, forming opinions about her life in real time. "It's not working," Agent Marsh said firmly, arriving 20 minutes after Rosa's frantic call. "This is a coordinated smear campaign, and frankly, it's sloppy enough that we're already tracing the IP addresses behind several of these posts. Ms. Bennett, I need you to understand something clearly. The desperation behind these attacks tells us exactly how strong our case actually is. Innocent men don't need this many distractions." Elena wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to that reassurance, the way she'd once held on to her father's flash drive. But 14 years of watching powerful men escape consequences had taught her a different lesson entirely. One that whispered constantly in the back of her mind, that people like Reeves always found a way to survive, always found someone else to sacrifice in their place. The night before the trial began, Elena couldn't sleep at all. She sat on the small balcony outside her room, staring out at the dark grounds below, when Adrian found her there, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, her eyes red from crying silently for the better part of an hour. "I keep thinking about my father," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "The night before he died, he sat me down and told me that sometimes doing the right thing costs more than we think we can survive paying. I didn't understand what he meant then. I think I finally understand it now." Adrian sat down beside her without a word, close enough that his presence felt like warmth against the cold night air. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever they try to say about you in that courtroom, you have people standing behind you now. That's not nothing, Elena. After 14 years of facing all of this by yourself, that has to count for something." "What if it's not enough?" she whispered. "What if they twist everything and Reeves walks free and Colton walks free, and all of this, everything I survived, everything my parents died for, ends up meaning nothing?" Adrian turned to face her fully, his expression fierce with a conviction that startled her. "Then we keep fighting," he said. "One trial doesn't end this. One verdict doesn't erase the truth on that drive. If they walk free tomorrow, we find another way, and another, until the truth finally lands somewhere it can't be buried again. I promise you, Elena, I am not walking away from this no matter how long it takes." Something in his certainty settled the storm raging inside her chest, at least enough to let her finally close her eyes and sleep for a few precious hours before the sun rose on the most important day of her adult life. The trial itself unfolded over 11 grueling days, each one testing Elena's resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. Reeves's defense attorney, a sharp, aggressive man named Preston Hale, spent hours attempting to dismantle her credibility on the stand, questioning her memory, her mental state. the validity of documents recovered from a device she'd carried hidden for 14 years. "Ms. Bennett," Hale said during cross-examination, his voice dripping with practiced skepticism. "You expect this jury to believe that a 17-year-old girl hiding behind a water heater in a moment of extreme trauma accurately identified voices she claims belong to my client and Mr. Whitfield, voices she hadn't heard again in 14 years with perfect clarity. I expect this jury to understand." Elena said, her voice steady, despite the tremor she felt beneath her ribs. "That trauma like that doesn't fade the way ordinary memories do. I have relived that night every single day for 14 years. I could pick those voices out of 1,000 others, because I have heard them in my nightmares more times than I can count. That sounds like exactly the kind of unreliable, emotionally compromised testimony this jury should be very cautious about accepting," Hale said, turning toward the jury box with practiced theatricality. "With respect," Elena said, her voice hardening with 14 years of accumulated strength. "I don't think trauma makes memory unreliable. I think it makes it permanent. And I don't think there's anything emotionally compromised about a woman who survived watching her father murdered, finally telling the truth about who did it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Elena caught Agent Marsh's small, satisfied nod from the gallery, a rare break in the woman's usually composed expression. The real turning point came on the 8th day when the prosecution introduced financial records from the flash drive directly linking specific payments from Reeves's personal accounts to falsified inspection reports bearing Diane Colton's forged signature. The paper trail was undeniable, meticulous, exactly the kind of evidence Elena's father had died trying to expose 14 years earlier. Colton herself called to testify against her own former colleagues in exchange for a reduced sentence broke down on the stand, confirming every detail. Whitfield had already provided, her voice shaking as she described falsifying safety reports on buildings she knew were structurally unsound buildings that would later collapse and kill 11 people in a fire. Everyone had been told was simply a tragic accident. "Did you know children were living in some of those buildings?" the prosecutor asked quietly. Colton's face crumbled. "Yes," she whispered. "I knew." "And you signed off on them anyway." "I was paid very well not to think about it too carefully." Colton admitted, tears streaming down her face, and the courtroom went utterly silent, the weight of 11 forgotten deaths finally settling into the room after 14 years of careful, deliberate erasure. Elena watched from the gallery, tears sliding silently down her own face, feeling something complicated and enormous move through her chest. Vindication, yes, but also a fresh wave of grief, the reminder that her family's murder hadn't happened in isolation, that an entire building full of strangers had paid the same terrible price for the same buried corruption. On the 10th day, Frank Delgado took the stand as part of his plea agreement. His testimony methodical and devastating, laying out in exhaustive detail exactly how Adrian's father had structured payments to Reed, to Whitfield, to Reeves, to Colton, over the course of nearly 2 decades, building an empire on a foundation of silence, purchased with other people's suffering. Adrian sat beside Elena in the gallery during that testimony, his hand finding hers without a word, his own face, a careful mask stretched thin over grief. For a father he had spent his entire life admiring, now forced to watch that admiration dismantled piece by piece in a public courtroom. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered to him during a brief recess. "Don't be," Adrian said, his voice rough. "You spent 14 years surviving what my father did. I think I can survive 1 week of hearing the truth about who he really was." The verdict came on the 12th day after a jury deliberation that felt to Elena like the longest 3 hours of her entire life. Guilty, on every single count. Senator Marcus Reeves, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. Diane Colton, despite her cooperation, still faced significant prison time for falsifying records that had directly contributed to 11 deaths. Charles Whitfield, already pleading guilty weeks earlier, received the harshest sentence of all, a judge showing little mercy for the man who had personally orchestrated the murder of 2 innocent people and spent 14 years hunting their surviving daughter. Thomas Reed, who had remained silent throughout the entire proceeding, was convicted on all counts as well, his composed mask never once cracking, even as the verdict was read. Though Elena noticed his hands trembling slightly as the bailiffs approached to lead him away. As they walked him past the gallery, Reed paused for one final moment, his eyes finding Elena's across the courtroom. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. And for the first time since that terrible night 14 years earlier, his voice carried something that sounded almost like genuine regret. "I am sorry it took this long for the truth to matter to anyone." Elena said nothing, simply held his gaze steadily until the bailiffs pulled him away. 14 years of fear finally completely extinguished in that single silent exchange. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the front steps, cameras flashing questions shouted from every direction. But Elena found herself unexpectedly calm amid the chaos, Adrian's steady presence beside her grounding her against the storm. "Ms. Bennett," one reporter called out, "how does it feel to finally see justice served after 14 years? Elena paused at the top of the steps, considering the question, carefully, feeling the weight of 14 years of silence finally lifting from her shoulders in the bright afternoon sunlight. "My father tried to do the right thing 14 years ago," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "He found evidence that powerful people were putting innocent lives at risk to protect their own profits, and he was murdered for trying to expose it. My mother died because she was married to a man who refused to stay silent about wrongdoing. I spent 14 years hiding because I was terrified the same thing would happen to me." She paused, looking directly into the nearest camera, her voice steady and unwavering. "Today proves that the truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people want it to. It waits. Sometimes it waits for 14 years. But it never actually dies, no matter how hard people try to bury it. And I hope every single person listening understands that staying silent in the face of wrongdoing only protects the people doing the wrong. My father understood that. It cost him everything. But today it finally mattered." The crowd erupted into a flurry of shouted follow-up questions. But Elena had said everything she needed to say. She turned, finding Adrian's steady gaze waiting for her, and allowed him to guide her gently through the chaos toward the waiting car. The months that followed brought a quiet, gradual transformation that Elena could hardly have imagined during those 14 years of careful invisibility. She testified at 2 additional related trials as more names surfaced from Whitfield's continued cooperation, each conviction chipping away at a network of corruption that had operated unchecked for nearly 2 decades. Adrian, true to his word, dismantled significant portions of his father's old organization, severing ties with anyone connected to the corruption. Elena's testimony had exposed restructuring his business interests toward legitimate ventures that no longer required the kind of secrets that had destroyed her family. It cost him considerably, both financially and in terms of the loyalty of men who had served his father for decades, but he never once wavered from the decision. Some of the old guard left within the first month. Marcus told Elena one evening, his shoulder fully healed now, though he still occasionally rubbed it absently when the weather turned cold. Adrian didn't try to stop a single one of them. Said if their loyalty depended on keeping secrets like that buried, they were never actually loyal to him in the first place. "How do you feel about all of it?" Elena asked. "You spent 15 years in intelligence work, and now you're watching an entire criminal organization restructure itself around principles most people would consider naive." Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think," he said slowly, "that I spent 15 years protecting powerful men because I believed power needed protecting, regardless of how it was used. Watching what happened to your family, watching what Adrian chose to do once he learned the truth. I think I finally understand that some things matter more than protecting power for its own sake." Elena found her own transformation more gradual, more difficult to name. She moved out of the estate eventually into a small apartment downtown. Not because she wanted distance from Adrian, but because she needed to prove to herself that she could build a life that belonged entirely to her, unconnected to hiding, unconnected to survival, simply hers. She began speaking publicly about surviving witness intimidation, about the long-term psychological impact of living under a false identity for over a decade, finding an unexpected calling in advocacy work that connected her with other survivors who had spent years hiding from people powerful enough to threaten their silence. The work was difficult, often reopening wounds she'd spent 14 years trying to close, but it also gave her something she'd never expected to find. Purpose. Adrian visited often during those months, patient in a way that surprised her, never pushing, never demanding more than she was ready to give, simply present steady, a constant reminder that not every powerful man used that power to harm the people around him. "You could have disappeared after the trial," he told her one evening, nearly 8 months after that terrible night, when everything had finally come apart and been rebuilt into something better. "Taken whatever settlement the government offered, moved somewhere quiet, lived the rest of your life in peace." "I thought about it," Elena admitted, "for about a day. But I realized something during the trial. I spent 14 years disappearing because I was afraid of what would happen if people saw me clearly. But hiding never actually made me safe, Adrian. It just made me invisible while the danger kept growing anyway. I don't want to be invisible anymore. I want to be someone who helps other people survive what I survived without having to hide for 14 years first." Adrian reached for her hand, and she let him take it. 14 years of careful distance, finally giving way to something she hadn't dared imagine possible. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "I don't think I've ever met anyone braver." "I wasn't brave," Elena said, though a small smile finally broke through her exhaustion. "I was terrified every single day. I think that's actually what bravery is. Being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." A year after that violent night at the Voss estate, Elena stood before a room full of survivors and advocates at a conference dedicated to witness protection reform. Her voice steady, her presence commanding in a way the frightened housekeeper, who once flinched from a simple touch on her shoulder, could never have imagined becoming. "My name is Sophia Bennett," she said, using her real name in public for the first time in 14 years. The words no longer carrying fear, but something closer to triumph. "For 14 years, I hid from the people who murdered my parents, because I believed disappearing was the only way to survive. I want every person in this room to understand something important. Survival isn't the same thing as living. I spent 14 years surviving. It took losing everything one more time before I finally understood the difference." She looked out at this crowd, seeing faces marked by their own hidden histories, their own carefully buried names, and felt something powerful settle into her chest. A certainty she had never possessed during those 14 long years of running. "The people who hurt my family believed that silence protects power," she continued. "They believed that fear could keep the truth buried forever. They were wrong. The truth survived 14 years hidden inside a flash drive around my neck because my father believed that someday someone brave enough would find the courage to use it. That courage found me eventually. It can find you too." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Elena barely heard it, her eyes finding Adrian standing near the back of the room, watching her with an expression that carried something far deeper than simple pride. Later that evening, standing together on the balcony of her apartment overlooking a city that no longer felt like a hiding place, but genuinely, finally, like home, Adrian turned to her with something serious settling into his features. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what happens next, for both of us." "And?" Elena asked, her heart beginning to pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what it would have looked like if I'd been brave enough to ask you to build something permanent with me," Adrian said. "You spent 14 years running from people who wanted to control your life through fear. I never want to be another person who makes you feel like you have to hide any part of yourself. I just want to build something real, with you, if you'll let me." Elena studied his face in the fading evening light, searching one final time for any trace of the calculation she'd spent 14 years learning to fear in powerful men, and found only steady, genuine devotion staring back at her. "I spent 14 years being nobody," she said softly, "so that I could survive long enough to finally become somebody worth knowing. I think I'd like to find out what that actually looks like, with you." Adrian's smile broke across his face like sunrise, and in that single, unguarded moment, Elena understood something she had spent 14 years believing impossible. Some people survive tragedy only to spend the rest of their lives hiding from it. But some people survive long enough to transform their deepest wound into their greatest strength, standing tall in the very light they once believed would destroy them. Proving beyond any doubt that the truth, no matter how long it waits, always finds its way home. And Elena Marlowe, once Sophia Bennett, once nobody at all, finally completely unshakably belonged exactly where she stood.